I'm delighted to introduce the next speaker in the conference this morning. Well known she is, Jen Cleland. Jen started her career with a BSc in psychology in Stirling, and from there moved to Belfast, where she did a PhD in rodent behaviour. I was just reflecting, actually, that understanding rodent behaviour stands us all in pretty good stead if you work for the universities or the NHS in the UK. But there we are. From there, she moved to Fife as a clinical psychologist and thence to Aberdeen, where she was interested in patients with respiratory diseases. And that's where the research career began. And it also took her into what she mentioned earlier as running the communication skills course in the University of Aberdeen Medical School. And that started her on her career of medical education research, from where the rise has really been exponential. Jen, as she said, occupies the John Simpson Chair of Medical Education Research in Aberdeen. John, as well as being, as she said, the first ASME gold medal winner, was a pathologist. And there's nothing that strange about this, I don't think. He's a colleague of mine, John. And Jen has used that chair very effectively. She's also the chair of the ASME board. She's the chair of the AME Research Committee. She's the director of the Scottish Medical Education Research Consortium, which is an innovation funded by NHS Education for Scotland and is in partnership with the 5 medical schools in Scotland: Aberdeen, Dundee, Edinburgh, Glasgow and St Andrews. She's also the director of the newly established Healthcare Education Research Centre for Healthcare Education Research and Innovation in the University of Aberdeen. We think we call it CHERI, but we've had discussions about whether it's Cherry, but it's CHERI if you want to look it up on the Aberdeen website. In addition to that, she has published widely and prolifically in the ASME journals and also other well-known educational publications. She has co-edited the ASME Green Book, that's Researching Medical Education, which you can see on the Wiley stand and buy one if you want. They're quite cheap and great value with an ASME label. And her current research interests are around medical careers research, researching the clinical learning environment, and widening access to medicine. And it's on that last topic that Jen's now going to speak to you. I welcome Jen Cleland.
Well, that was a lot better than I feared, because Peter and I know each other very well, and he's been threatening me for the last few days about the kind of things he was going to say when he announced me. So yes, I was amused when Salim introduced himself yesterday and said that his career started with rats, and I thought, that's good, we have something in common, from rats to widening access. I did go via monkeys for a year or two, but realised that working in a hut in Africa was not where I wanted to be for the rest of my life. Not enough access to wine bars and clothes shops. So today I'm going to talk about widening access to medicine, and very much in the UK context, because I'm aware that most people in the room today are based in the UK, and that's where our bread and butter work is. So I'm going to talk about the UK, but bring in references from elsewhere in the world where relevant and where we don't actually have the UK evidence. So I always think a bit of context and a bit of history is appropriate. So our context is the UK, but what is that UK context? So in 1997, the Deering report was published. And I know this is 30 years ago, but this was really the beginning of widening access to higher education in the UK. And it was a very impactful report. It was actually the report that paved the way for scrapping maintenance grants and bringing in that students paid their own tuition fees. But that's the other side of it. But interestingly, Deering looked at widening access from an economic perspective, that the UK would be better placed internationally if it had a more educated workforce to work at a kind of global level. And he regarded, or in the report, the gains to the individual in terms of social mobility. If you're better educated, then you get a better job, then you earn more. That was kind of secondary to his argument about the UK having this better workforce. But when you dig into the report further, this was a time when actually hardly anybody, relatively speaking, went into higher education. There was about kind of 13-14% were going into higher education in 1997. And you can see from that graph it goes up to about 30% in further along. And now it's about 50%, but there is actually quite a variation by region in the UK. Scotland with the highest proportion of people in at university. Just thought I'd throw that in. But no matter what's been happening over at the time of Deering and since then, there's low rates of participation from people in certain socioeconomic groups. And Deering noted that there was a two-tier system in education in the UK where people from relatively privileged pasts moved on to relatively privileged futures. And if you were from a less privileged background, well, you kind of stayed in a less privileged group as your life went on. And a very positive thing that came out of the Deering report but was specific funding for widening access to higher education. And that funding went to institutions that could demonstrate a commitment to widening participation and have a strategy, mechanisms for monitoring progress, and so on and so forth. But interesting, given the kind of neoliberal market, Deering recommended that institutions decide in their own way how they were going to do widening access. There wasn't a national directive. It was up to each university and each institution how they did this. A very individualistic approach, and one that you can still see today with different institutions having very different attitudes towards widening participation and having very different success rates in terms of what kind of students are coming over the threshold. So the Deering report was really quite high-level rhetoric. There wasn't much in terms of the kind of practicalities of how do we do this, but it led to the Schwartz report in 2004, Fair Admissions to Higher Education. And this report kind of very much did what it says in the tin. It recommended what to do for good practice. And there was 5 key principles in the Schwartz report, and I've just listed the 3 main ones here, the 3 that to me are most pertinent to medicine. One was that admissions system should be transparent. Second, we should be assessing or selecting on the basis of not just prior achievement, but also potential. And third, that a fair admissions system should use reliable and valid assessment methods. So, how far have we got since 2004 on these 3 principles? Well, medical schools responded in 3 main ways to Schwartz. There was data monitoring, interventions, and changes to admissions practices. I'm going to talk a little bit about those. Each of those. Data monitoring is kind of the easiest one. I mean, it's interesting that people weren't monitoring data before then, but now we're always reporting on what we do, aren't we? You know, it's always feeding information up to the GMC, to the Medical Schools Council, to our own internal mechanisms. What do we do and how do we do things? There's probably over-monitoring now. But with the MSAR returns to the GMC and the MSc, there's specific questions about student admissions, there's specific questions about students with protected characteristics, and have you done any innovations? And a number of years ago, I reviewed the MSAR returns for the Medical Schools Council to look at what was being listed in terms of widening access and selection. And quite a number of institutions will use what they do at that stage as an example of innovation. You know, we have this widening access programme, this is what we do, or we've changed our selection processes. So actually lots of really interesting data. But interestingly, although every medical school is engaged in widening access activities, and they're reporting them in the data monitoring returns, which they have to do, people aren't really publishing in this. And first, before I sort of talk about the research evidence, just not everybody will be directly involved in widening access and selection. So just to give you a bit of a flavour of the kind of activities that go on in most medical schools, when Sandra Nicholson and I wrote this chapter, we categorised things as in-reach and outreach. So, and those seem to be quite well-known terms. We'll just wait for the phone. Simon. So there's residential, the in-reach is kind of when you're bringing students into your medical school to give both to give them information, advice and guidance, but also to give them a bit of an idea of what a medical school is like and what hall of residence is like and what an anatomy lab looks like and that kind of thing. So they get to see more because they come into where all the facilities are. But there's also lots of outreach programs, mentoring by students or by staff, students or staff going out to schools, kind of having sessions on, applying for medicine, what's medicine like, is medicine for you? Lots and lots of activities. And I know at my own university, we do lots of this type of thing. But people, as I say, weren't really kind of publishing on it. And we did a literature search and we identified just 10 studies reporting on the success of widening access programs. And that was in a long time period, 17 years. We kept it broad. We started when the Deering report was published, and we wanted to see what had happened since. And the studies really split into two categories. Most of them were small-scale, single-site studies of this is what we did at Aberdeen, Glasgow, wherever it might be, and this is what we found. Whereas the other two studies were great big national database number crunching studies, looking at things like UK CAR or the impact of foundation programmes. With the single site studies, the outcome measures were very, very loose. They were very much about participant satisfaction. So we did our widening access programme and those that took part on it liked it. Fine. But, what was the actual impact? Did more people come into medical school? Did they stay in medical school? How many people attended your courses, applied and were successful? Very little of that kind of data. Some, but generally very little. And the big number crunching exercises were interesting because they showed that although there'd been a lot of structural changes at a national level, specifically bringing in foundation programs, graduate entry programs, things hadn't really changed that much. There'd been surprisingly little change. And on the basis of what was published, we summarised, I'm afraid, that there was lots of activity, but little evidence that any of it actually had any impact. So we thought, right, well, let's look at what else is going on. So we thought, well, what was happening in 2004 when the Schwartz report was published? What was happening in terms of medical school admissions? And the things were happening, there was 3 methods of selection in those days. There was prior attainment, references and personal statements. And just before we go any further, could I have a show of hands? Who is actually involved in the selection processes at their universities? Okay, a fair number of you. Well, you might like this. This is a definition of a personal statement that I found recently. And having read thousands of applications to do medicine in my time, I'm not sure the humbling is necessarily appropriate. I always feel terribly inadequate reading personal statements, thinking, gosh, when I was 17, I hadn't saved the world or climbed Kilimanjaro or saved my sibling from their burning pajamas. Remember that one? 411 incidences of that in personal statements one year. Yes, which will bring me, I'll talk about later. Yeah. So how effective were these selection methods, indeed all selection methods? And we were commissioned by the General Medical Council in 2011 to review carry out a systematic review of all the different selection methods in medicine. And we updated that review, and it was published in Medical Education last year. And as an aside, can I say that although I submit papers to Medical Education, Kevin is just as likely to reject my papers as he is anybody else's. There's complete editorial independence. But we were very pleased with this one. And we went through the main selection tools in medicine. And not all of these, some of these are used more in other contexts in the UK, but we went through all of them because the GMC wanted to see what the evidence was. So I'm just going to report on the 3 that were used in 2004. So we looked at academic records, and they were the most widely used selection method, and so they're the best studied. So, a moderate predictor of medical school performance. Yeah? And if you look at the correlations, they're not outstanding. There's a moderate predictive validity going on there from what you go into medical school with to how you do as a medical student. Well, and then it's kind of less so when you move on to become into the clinical years and into being a doctor. And what was also interesting when we looked at those studies most closely, and there's a lot of them, certainly in the UK context, a lot of the data is quite old. The data is reporting on when people entered with 3 Bs at A-level. It's not contemporary populations where people are getting A stars, and where we're at, we are actually having to use, or people use prior attainment to sift through a sheer volume of applications. Things have changed a little bit, and should we be using evidence from a previous time educationally to inform our practice now, but then we don't have anything else? Prior attainment does have many advantages. Using that as the first selection tool does have many advantages for medical schools because actually it doesn't cost us anything. This is not a medical school assessment. This is not something we have to pay for directly. Yes, there's fees to UCAS to be part of the system, but it's not particularly costly. And theoretically, we're using standardised and well-recognised assessments. But as I said, not particularly predictive of clinical performance. A-levels, hires, all these things are losing their their discriminatory ability because of grade inflation. And really importantly for widening access, there is a huge socioeconomic class bias when it comes to school attainment. So failure to acquire the required grades is the most common reason for not getting into medical school. But attainment is hugely based on your schooling. So for most people, you go to the school that's nearest your home. That's the school that you have access to. Now, if that's a good school, great. You will be nurtured. You will get decent teaching. You will do as well as you're going to do. If your parents are well off, you may have private tutors for the subjects that you're not so good at. If you live somewhere urban, you may choose to go. You may be go to a fee-paying school rather than the nearest state school. There's lots of opportunities. But for many people, it's what they get. They can only get what's down the road. And if you're somewhere where the school isn't particularly good, then that has a massive impact on how well you attain at school. And there's particular issues around different parts of the country. So, I'm based in the northeast of Scotland, so our catchment area is the whole of the Highlands and Islands. If your nearest school is 200 miles away, or you have to get a ferry to it, and you have to board somewhere during the week, or you don't want to be sent away, you want to go to the local school, and it's not particularly good because it can't attract teachers because nobody wants to live in the back of beyond. There's not those places are not desirable for doctors and they're not desirable for teachers either. So there's all sorts of things influence how people do at school if it's not to do with their ability. Moving on from my hobby horse to personal statements, you probably already understand my view of personal statements from the comments earlier, but they are a widespread selection method, but there's really very little evidence that they predict any sort of performance in medical school or thereafter. There's some evidence, people like them, candidates like them, particularly those candidates who have somebody to help them write their personal statement. I have recently become very popular in our neighbourhood for the children of parents who are not doctors come and knock on my door at a certain time of year going, "Jen, you know about these things, don't you? Can you help us write our personal statements?" And I really struggle with this. Should I help? Shouldn't I help? Other children have the social capital of having parents and family who can help them write their personal statements. Why shouldn't I help so-and-so? I'm their social capital. But it's kind of challenging. But there is the potential for a lot of external help. There's the potential for plagiarism, as in the 411 students who had saved their brothers when their pyjamas went on fire. Yeah, those 411 incidents weren't reported in the popular press. So, okay. And the information is used inconsistently. Having been involved in the selection process, even in those days, I would have a bunch of personal statements to assess using criteria. My colleague would have the same. We would come at it from completely different perspectives because we were different people with our own baggage, with our own backgrounds, with our own view of things. And our criteria were kind of pretty ropey anyway. So, and looking at medical schools around the UK, those that I've visited or I've talked to people, every medical school uses the personal statement in a different way. And what about references? I mean, really, references aren't worth the paper that they're written on. So I won't talk any further about that because you can read. So we've got personal statements are biased, references aren't worth the paper they're written on, prior attainment is all linked in with schooling, so, right, it's not great. What about then, shall we look at not just achievement but also potential, and shall we do so in a valid and reliable way? Well, I think we've kind of knocked some of the validity and reliability arguments in the head, but what about potential? And one of the other responses to the Schwartz report was bringing in the UK CAT, the first year of which was 2006, you may remember. So really UK CAT's been used for about 10 years now. And this talk isn't about UK CAT research, but I just wanted to highlight one point, that the way that UK CAT was set up is they have ploughed a lot of money into independent research of the impact of UK CAT and the predictive validity and so on. Unlike some of the other tools in the market, they put the research out to tender, so it's not done in-house, which you can see that there are advantages to the model, and it's the consortium of medical schools, so it's kind of led by the users, which is a nice system. So where are we now in 2017? Well, things have changed. We've still got prior attainment at the beginning. Then most places are using an admissions test, like the UK CAT being the most common, but others are used as well. And then most universities, but not all, are doing interviews. It's very much recommended that all universities use an interview, preferably an MMI rather than a traditional interview, but not all are fully engaged in that. The transparency is an interesting question. Again, this was work we did for the Medical Schools Council, but I'm not going to talk about the work, I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. It must be incredibly hard as an applicant to medicine to figure out what it's all about. If you look at the medical school web pages, there is no kind of consistency or standardisation about selection and widening access. They all talk about widening access. There is widening access mentioned in all the web pages because it has to be, but if you can find it is another matter. And the Medical Schools Council have suggested that you should be able to find the page of widening access within 3 clicks. I challenge you to go and look at all the medical school websites and do that. But this is one example of some sort of transparency about what the process is like. I'm not going to tell you what university, it doesn't matter, but if you were a candidate, this is actually a web page. You find it quite straightforwardly. Here's the process, here's the timelines, here's what you've got to do, here's the weightings, here's how you are assessed to get into medicine. The academic score at this particular institution, well, it's reasonably low, but it's the first hurdle. UK CAT and then interviews for the 800 or so highest scoring applicants offers rejection. So, that's relatively clear. If you were a potential applicant, I think you could follow that. But then I looked at another medical school and I couldn't actually find what I was looking for. And I eventually found this information on page 28 of a 36-page attachment. And I'm not a medical student. I know what I'm looking for. And this took me quite some time. So here's the breakdown of how they're selected in this particular medical school. Different, much more weighting on prior attainment, less weighting in the UK CAT. I'm not sure from this if academic's the first hurdle, then it's non-academic, then it's UK CAT, because that's a kind of interest, or, is there a kind of cut-off? Are you out at each stage? There's not actually a huge amount of information here. And again, in this school, graduates and mature students are treated differently, and they're assessed differently. Now, I know of absolutely no evidence base for this. And actually, there's very little evidence base for how we weight and use the particular selection tools that we use. There may be nothing wrong with the selection tools that we use, but how do we know how much each should be weighed? Should we be weighting 50% in the interview? Should it be 20%? Who knows? There is actually absolutely no evidence out there. And the MSc have commissioned some studies to look at, do some statistical modelling to see if different applicants would be admitted to medical school if the proportions for the main tools were different, if the weightings were different. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. But with all these changes, with people changing from really having a huge dependence on personal statements and references to moving more to the MMIs, to the aptitude tests, have things actually changed? Well, Milburn doesn't think so. This is the report that encouraged the GMC to invest in this work. And Milburn highlighted that actually medicine's been pretty good at diversifying the workforce in terms of women and ethnic minority groups, but not in socioeconomic class. So this was, 13 years after the Widening report, and nothing really had happened. But it did, Milburn's report fairly kick-started some focus into the area. And as a consequence, the Selecting for Excellence group of the Medical Schools Council was set up, and the Medical Schools Council Selection Alliance. And between those things, there's been an enormous amount invested in selection and widening access research over the last few years in the UK. And I would say that we're at a point in time where we know more about widening access and selection in medicine than we ever have. But of course, it's like all research, the more you do, the more questions you find, the more kind of gaps you identify. But we certainly have much more knowledge. But again, even looking at more contemporary data, things haven't really changed very much. This is a time series analysis which hasn't been published yet, looking at medical schools and looking at when they brought in dramatic changes in admissions, so brought in an interview or dropped the weighting of something else. And even with individual medical schools doing lots of change in their selection procedures, you can see that the lines are pretty much flat. Who we are admitting to medical school is not changing. What we're doing isn't making any difference. On that happy note, no, I will not. We have to change. Things have to change. We now have clear targets for change. Instead of the usual kind of 9% of medical students are from the lower socioeconomic groups, which has been the case for like as long as anybody can remember, that has to be doubled for 2022 in England and Wales. In Scotland, we've got an even more ambitious target, which is like typical of the Scottish Government size. We have to have 20% of the 20% of our student intake should be from this lower socioeconomic groups, and that's across higher education. But we do have from till 2030 to do that. So, wherever people are trying, there's lots of activity going on. People are trying to take best evidence, they're trying to change their practice, but really nothing's happening. So how can there must be still some barriers, what's happening? How can we break down these barriers? And I think this links with what Celine was talking about yesterday in terms of the social accountability agenda. In the UK, there's still very much the perception that widening access is about social mobility. It's about social justice. It's about helping individuals kind of progress in life, to move from a less privileged background to a more privileged background. And it's usually associated with the kind of the meritocratic discourse that widening access is a way of attracting bright students who haven't had many opportunities. It's not about admitting people that have lower qualifications. It's about kind of reaching out and letting in a terrible phrase that's in the literature, the rough diamonds. Okay? And the system very much is about, well, medicine works. Our system works. So why do we need to change? Well, and whether our system works or not depends on your perspective, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. If your perspective is our graduation rates, then yes, medical selection really does work. Medicine has outstanding retention. We retain 98% of those that we select into medical school. Now, universities love this. This is great. It makes them look good. When you think that in some other courses there's 30 to 50% student loss over time, if you've got a medical school, you can be sure that will make you look good. That will look good in terms of who is graduated, or the proportions that are graduated. But again, it comes back to the fact that our selection is not fair. We are letting in people. It's not the same starting point for everybody that comes into the selection process. Disadvantage starts young. And then if we're expecting everybody to come kind of through the selection process in the same way at age 17, it's not a level playing field. So if we try to change the discourse, the kind of the way that we look at widening access to medicine in the UK, maybe that's one way we can change the situation, because nothing else we've been doing has been working. So, I mean, yeah, picking up on what Mei Ling was saying, maybe we need a clean slate. Maybe we have to start by doing something completely different, by thinking about it completely differently. And should widening access be about reaching out to help individuals, or should it be about meeting the needs of our communities? And by community, you can interpret community in a number of levels. It could be the immediate vicinity of the medical school, it could be the region, it could be the UK as a whole. That doesn't matter. It's about, can we help, what can we do in terms of selection to help medicine in the UK? This discourse is quite common in other countries, and there are numerous facets to it, such as a more diverse medical school body will make a better medical school. It will be more, it'll be a better learning environment. There's some evidence, mostly from the US, that like will treat like. So if we let in people from the diversity of backgrounds that you can see in the UK population, then they those people that we let in will then go back and treat their own populations. You know, there's some evidence for that. But if you think about widening access as social accountability, in my mind, it's a kind of workforce planning, workforce partnership model at heart, as opposed to a reaching out and helping students. But we've looked at this in the UK, and this was a paper that was published a couple of years ago, I think. What was coming out when we spoke to admissions deans was that most medical schools were really sticking to kind of the social justice, social mobility agenda. They were kind of reaching out. And there was only actually a few schools that were thinking more about if we recruit students from locally, then they will then serve the local population. So actually, very few schools were using the social accountability discourse. And there's a paper in the BORPA, terrible acronym, Best Research Paper session later on this morning by Kirsty Alexandra, who actually went and looked at all the medical school web pages to see what the discourses were in the web pages. So if you're interested in this, there'll be more later in the morning. But the medical school attitudes are very much stuck in meritocracy and social justice. So can we do things differently? Can we change enough to change who we let in? And I think the main thing is, who are we trying to select? Are we trying to select kids that graduate from medicine? Because, well, if we are, we're fine. We're doing exactly what, we're doing that. But if we are selecting people that we actually want to work in the UK NHS, well, we're not doing a particularly good job, are we? We've got a not fit for purpose workforce, and a lot of the data is international. But if you just look at the UK, we have a huge shortage and maldistribution of doctors across different regions and across different specialties. And my particular interest is in students and foundation programme doctors and trainees. And you all know this statistics, 50% of FY2s are not applying for a training post. The training posts that are filled vary by region. Everybody wants to work in London. I have no idea why. I work in the northeast, but everybody wants to work in London. And there's shortages in many specialties. The emergency medicine one being particularly frightening. So only a quarter of emergency medicine training posts were filled last year. Well, don't get run over. We are not selecting a workforce that then go on to do what we want them to do. And if we shift from this discourse of, hey, we're great at selecting in medicine, they all graduate, to thinking, well, they're not, the outcomes are different. If the outcomes are staffing our NHS, then we're not selecting effectively. So if we do, the pipelines are broken, the chains are fraying, the system is under strain. Those of you that work in NHS environments will be well aware how stressful it is if training posts aren't filled and there's not enough trainees to deliver service. And of course, there might not be enough trainees to deliver service now, but it also means there's not going to be enough people to fill consultant posts in 4, 5, 6 years' time. So the problems will just trickle on throughout the system. The system is very much at breaking point. And if we shift our outcomes to workforce planning, to social accountability, how could we do this? How could we make it effective? Do we want to recruit locally? Do we want to recruit from underserved areas? Do we want to recruit people that want to work in specialties where we need them to work? Then we have to teach them, but that's a whole different other talk. That's for another time. So, do we want to recruit locals? Well, probably yes. We've done numerous studies, and as have other people, and in our current populations of medical students, final year medical students, FY2s and trainees, they want to be near family and friends. They want to train and work near family and friends. So, shall we recruit people, like if we need 10% of our doctors to be in the northeast of Scotland, for example, then maybe we should be looking at 10% of our medical student population being drawn from that region. People will leave region to go to medical school, and quite often they will stay away for foundation programme. There's certainly patterns that people like to do their foundation programme in the same place that they've been at medical school because they're familiar with the hospitals and a lot of their friends will be there, and that, kind of sensible reasons. But then they will look for a training post, and failing that, a consultant job back home. And about a third of GPs consultants will go back home to work. So this idea of recruiting locals could be one way of tackling the issues. And as I mentioned earlier, it's about proportion as well. And there's from Scotland, this is about drilling down a bit. We actually produce enough graduate doctors in Scotland to staff Scotland. But unfortunately, half of them then leave because they're not from Scotland. They follow these patterns, they leave region to go and do their medical programme, and then they leave thereafter to do the foundation programme or their training. So it looks great on the surface, we're producing our 800 doctors a year, but it's not. We're really only producing about 400 that want to work in Scotland. Do we want to be recruiting for more diverse groups? If you look around the world, there's lots and lots of evidence that the pipeline programmes, the rural medical schools, the medical schools that are set up with particular social accountability agendas, these are effective. There's less evidence from the UK, probably just because people haven't been looking at this, but John Dowell, who is somewhere in the audience, carried out this study looking at Scottish GPs, and he found that those who were from kind of less privileged backgrounds were more likely to work in a deprived area than those that were from more traditional medical school backgrounds. And those that were from remote and rural areas were more likely to go home and work in remote and rural areas. So even what UK data there is does fit in with the international data. There's also who do we want to take in terms of what do they want to do. We've done a lot of studies of medical student career decision making, and they're quite entertaining. The year one students, about 40% of them want to be surgeons. And they often want to be incredibly specific kinds of surgeons, things that I've never heard of half the time. And things that Peter assures me there is only one training post and one job in the whole of the UK for. And we are selecting people not on the basis of what they want to be when they leave medical school, but we're selecting a group that have quite clear career plans, and those don't fit in with what we need. There are individual preferences, so none of this will surprise you, I suspect. Who wants to be a surgeon? Males, certain ethnic groups, those for whom prestige is important and who earnings are important. And who wants to be a GP? Females, those for whom work-life balance is important, those for whom continuity of patient care is important. There's plenty of evidence for this from all over the world. Interestingly, in terms of hospital medicine, if you want a good work-life balance, then you're more likely to prefer anaesthetics. So, but what's happening is that people are coming into medical school with very clear ideas about what they do with their career, they want to do with their careers. A relatively small percentage are shifting their thinking, far fewer than you would think, but that's down to our hidden curriculums, the fact that we're not exposing them to the specialties where we want people to work, we're not exposing them to enough rotations in the specialties where we need them to work. So, there's a lot going on at medical school, but it's not pushing things in the direction in which we want it. So what can we do? There are some patterns. We are seeing some patterns in terms of who wants to stay and who wants to go. There are the personal preferences, such as work-life balance, continuity of care, that type of thing is important, but we're just analysing some UK med data, And we've looked at those who are more likely to stay in after the foundation programme, who are more likely to apply for a training post in FY2 versus those that take a break from training. And we are identifying some patterns that women are less likely to take a break, people from ethnic minority backgrounds are less likely to take a break, mature students are less likely to take a break, or graduates are less likely to take a break. And there's kind of logical reasons for a lot of that. But without thinking about social engineering, which we can't do we need to be thinking more about how we can integrate the kind of evidence base that we have now into selection? We can't throw prior attainment out. We need to have some evidence that people can cope with the workload of medicine. But do we start taking into account contextual factors? Where are people from? What are their career preferences at age 16, 17, since a lot of the time that'll stay? What is it that they want out of a job? Do we want to be looking more at personal characteristics like resilience and grit? And there's some more evidence I forgot to mention that those who are more likely to apply for training in FY2 are those for whom a supportive working environment is not so important. Which is maybe not something we want to boast about, but it is probably a good characteristic. To be resilient is probably a good characteristic for working in today's NHS. Do we keep an aptitude test? Do we want to assess potential, and maybe more so if we're going to drop admissions in terms of prior attainment? And do we keep the interview? I think that the admissions process needs to be more holistic. We need to bring other things in. And it's not just about chucking tests at people. It's about actually finding out about our applicants and looking at their backgrounds and their preferences and how they want to work. A more socially accountable model of selection. And I wanted to finish on this note. Flexner, more than 100 years ago, said that we have no right to set up the profession to poor boys. And I mean, now it's poor boys and poor girls. But we still have these barriers. The doors are still closed to certain social groups. And that's 100 years later. We really have to do something differently if we want to change the status quo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jen. As ever, an enlightening performance. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got 5 minutes or so for questions before coffee. Sir, halfway up there.
Thank you. Phil Smith, Cardiff. The other problem is that the attributes that people have change with time, and in particular, boys appear to be disadvantaged when selected at the age of 17 compared to the age of 25. Mm-hmm. How can we address that issue?
Graduate entry?
Yeah, it's expensive. That's the other problem, isn't it?
Yeah. I think, people do change. Boys have the disadvantage of being just, less mature at the beginning of medical school. Our system is that 90% of our medical students are school leavers. So, yeah, maybe we have to take that into account. But maybe we can take it into account. If we start looking at and digging a little bit and seeing what the patterns are, there's no reason why we can't have sort of slightly different ways of interpreting data if they're from males and females when it's school leavers. Jill, Celine?
Hi, Jill Thistlewaite from Sydney. We haven't really mentioned cost. Cost was just alluded to there. Graduate entry is an additional at least 2 years on the cost. Scotland, we know, compared to the rest of the UK, is cheaper. Australia is expensive. It really is something that's dividing selection because of the additional years that have been added onto courses as we move to more graduate entry programs. So I just wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Well, it's interesting because if you look at the data, traditionally, people from lower socioeconomic groups are more debt averse than those from higher socioeconomic groups. But those patterns seem to be changing as society is changing. There seems to be far less debt aversion across all the social groups than there was 10 or 20 years ago. And there is definitely a change in attitude towards having the kind of debt that I wouldn't be able to sleep at night if I had. But some countries have set up reasonably good systems for payback. And if we can set up decent systems, then that shouldn't necessarily be a barrier. Salim?
Can I just say final question now?
Salim,
just down the steps for you. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. Very enlightening to hear the UK perspective, UK-specific issues and data. I wanted to pick up on your point about social engineering. So that's an often repeated criticism of things like pipeline programs and so on. What's missing in that conversation is that not doing the pipeline programs is also social engineering. It's sort of like having a pipeline program for the privileged, actually. So I was just wondering how you work your rhetorical strategies with the naysayers within our profession to kind of point out that this is really, we've really been doing social engineering. It hasn't been with a focus on equity or diversity or social accountability.
yes, we point that out quite frequently. But it's about chipping away at the dominant discourse. Nothing happens overnight. Change is difficult. I think things, although I was a bit negative there, I do think things are changing in terms of attitudes, and it is about attitudes. It is about attitudes towards medicine, medical education, who we need as students. But we have to just keep chipping away, change things and provide some evidence. People like evidence, particularly if you're from a biomedical background. Some statistics are always nice. So the more we can do of the big number crunching studies, UK Med will be very helpful in that aspect, and I know there's a workshop in that later. We actually now have the systems in place in the UK that we can start looking at things and saying, this is the pattern. Here are you might think I'm talking nonsense, but actually here's the data.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. In drawing this session to a close, just to remind you, we start with the parallel sessions at 11 o'clock in the various rooms. Jen, thank you very much.
Thank you.